Hi friends, once again welcome back to the channel. This video covers the travel rules, especially quarantine rules across Indian states. If you travel to any of states in India during Unlock 4.0 phase, what are the things of quarantine you have to take care? This will be a faster video. Each state is going to take only one slide and we will just show only how many days and where you have to quarantine, details for each states. It will be in alphabetical order, so if you wanted to skip or if you wanted to interested only in particular state, you can skip it to the state. So let us start quickly with Andhra Pradesh. As you can see in Andhra Pradesh, if you are traveling to Andhra Pradesh as a domestic traveler from Chennai, Mumbai, Delhi, Gujarat, Rajasthan and Madhya Pradesh, you will be sent to institutional quarantine for 7 days. And any other areas will be sent to home quarantine for 14 days. If you are an international traveler to Andhra Pradesh, institutional quarantine is advised only if you are symptomatic, otherwise you are going to 14 days of home quarantine. Assam, if you are Assam domestic traveler, you will be undergoing a COVID swab test, and if you are positive, you will be sent to institutional quarantine for 7 days, otherwise you will be sent to 10 days of home quarantine. If you are international travel to Assam, symptomatic will be sent to institutional, otherwise 10 days of home quarantine. In Bihar, as you can see, there is no quarantine for both domestic as well as international travelers. In Chhattisgarh, if you are a domestic traveler, symptomatic means institutional quarantine. If no symptoms, you are taken to 14 days of home quarantine. This is same for both domestic as well as international travelers of Chhattisgarh. In Delhi, 7 days of home quarantine if you are a domestic traveler, and international 7 days institutional quarantine as well as 7 days home quarantine. If you have a test report of negative within 96 hours of prior to journey, you will be exempted from quarantine. As you can see, in Goa, no quarantine is required for both domestic as well as international. In Gujarat, as you can see, no quarantine for asymptomatic. If you are symptomatic, institutional quarantine for domestic. If you are international traveler, 7 days of institutional quarantine and 7 days home quarantine. Test report apply here also. In Haryana, as you can see, home quarantine of 14 days for a domestic traveler. International traveler will go under symptomatic, means you will go under institutional quarantine, otherwise 14 days of home quarantine. In Himachal Pradesh, if you are a domestic traveler, 14 days of home quarantine for passengers from red zone, or if you have any symptoms, otherwise you are exempted. International traveler, 7 days of institutional quarantine as well as 7 days home quarantine. In Jammu and Kashmir, mandatory COVID-19 test will be conducted upon arrival, and if you are positive, you will be sent to COVID facility or institutional quarantine. Otherwise, if you are negative, mandatory home quarantine for 14 days. And international also will have 7 days institutional as well as 7 days of home quarantine. In Jharkhand, as you can see, 14 days of home quarantine for all the passengers, irrespective domestic as well as international. In Karnataka, there is no quarantine for domestic traveler. If you are international, no symptoms means 14 days of home quarantine, otherwise you will be going to COVID health care center dedicated. In Kerala, for domestic, 14 days of home quarantine is advised. After, there is an option for getting COVID test after 7 days. If you are negative, you are going to without quarantine, otherwise again 7 more days. So basically it will go to 14 days of quarantine for domestic. And international, if you are symptomatic, institutional quarantine, otherwise home quarantine for 14 days. Madhya Pradesh, symptomatic is going to institutional quarantine for 10 days. For others, home quarantine for 7 days. This is same for domestic as well as international. In Maharashtra, 14 days of home quarantine for domestic traveler, 7 days institutional and 7 days home quarantine for international traveler. In Manipur, all passengers 14 days of institutional quarantine, irrespective you are domestic or international. In Meghalaya, as you can see, institutional for 48 hours, institutional quarantine, and if you are negative you can travel home with 14 days of home quarantine. This is the same for domestic as well as international. In Mizoram, 14 days of institutional quarantine, 14 days of home quarantine provided if it is clear, and this is same for a domestic traveler and international traveler, and depends on the test. As you can see, rapid antibody test. In Nagaland, as you can see, institutional quarantine for 7 days, 14 days of home quarantine, and this is same for domestic as well as international traveler. In Odisha, all passengers of domestic will go to undergo home quarantine for 14 days, and even international will go for 14 days of home quarantine. In Punjab, 14 days of home quarantine for domestic, and for international total 14 days. Out of that, 7 days institutional and 7 days home quarantine. In Rajasthan, 14 days of voluntary home quarantine for domestic as well as international. In Tamil Nadu, domestic traveler home quarantine is mandatory for 14 days, and who test positive will be taken to hospital isolation, otherwise you can go home. International traveler of Tamil Nadu, 7 days of institutional and 7 days of home. In Telangana, domestic traveler will not have any quarantine. International traveler, 7 days institutional and 7 days home quarantine. In Tripura, 14 days of home quarantine for domestic, and for international institutional quarantine till results are declared. That means you have to get a negative test to exempt from institutional quarantine. And in Uttar Pradesh, as you can see, domestic traveler 14 days of home quarantine, international 7 days of institutional quarantine and 7 days home quarantine, so 14 days total again. In Uttarakhand, as you can see, a domestic traveler will have 7 days of institutional quarantine, and if you are arriving with COVID-19 infected district, then you will go for institutional, otherwise 7 days of home quarantine. So total 14 days you have to go for. International traveler of Uttarakhand will have 7 days of institutional quarantine followed by 7 days of home quarantine. And the last state is the West Bengal. Here domestic traveler will have 14 days of self-monitored, that means home quarantine. For symptomatic, health authorities will decide whether you have to go for home quarantine or institutional or some other place, depends on your conditions. International traveler of West Bengal will have 7 days of institutional quarantine followed by 7 days of home quarantine. Apart from these general things I would like to discuss here is, there are exemptions under special categories like government officials, military people, etc. This is applicable to all the states, and there are also options for emergency medical and short visit passes for most of the states. If you are going for a treatment, or you are going something like in case of death of close people, and there are exemptions that way. And also you have short visit pass in most of the states, where if you are staying within 7 days you don't need to get quarantined. Also there will be changes in time to time, but this is the latest as per today. And one more thing I have to say is, most of the states have exemptions for pregnant women, children below 10 years, and senior citizens above 75 years. These are common rules. I'm not going state by state. Most of the states have these rules in place. Thank you very much for watching this video. If you like the video, kindly give us a like button press. Also please subscribe to our channel. Thank you very much. See you with another video.